My name is Clara Whitmore, and I am 27 years old. It's been exactly 1 year since I stood outside Eldridge First National Bank, shivering in a faded wool coat, holding a rejection letter in trembling hands. It was Christmas Eve, 1958, and I was $207,000 in debt. The bank had refused my final loan appeal that morning, calling me a high-risk investment and handing me the letter like it was a mercy. I had no family left. My father passed that spring after 2 years of fighting lung fever and bills that drained the life from both of us. My mother? She left when I was 13. I inherited Papa's broken-down wood shop and a ledger full of red ink. I was a seamstress by heart, but who'd come to a girl with no husband, no connections, and no capital? So, I went home that day to the cold, creaking floorboards of our old cabin on Larkspur Hill, and I cried. I remember thinking, this can't be how it ends. That same night, I met Jonathan Blake. He came into my life like a warm fire in the dead of winter. I had gone to Maudie's diner to warm my fingers and pretend I could still afford a pie. Jonathan sat at the counter beside me, tall, clean-shaven, black overcoat, gold cufflinks, and smiled like he already knew my name. You're Clara Whitmore, aren't you? He asked. I blinked. Yes. Have we met? He chuckled low and kind. Not officially. My uncle used to work lumber with your father. He always said you had your father's grit. I suppose he was right. I didn't know what hit me first, his charm, his voice, or the way he offered to pay for my coffee without making me feel small. We spoke for 2 hours that night, until Maudie herself kicked us out. By the time we stepped outside, the snow had thickened into a velvet sheet across Main Street. I slipped once, and he caught me with both arms and a smile that stayed in my head the whole way home. In the days that followed, he kept showing up. At my door, at the diner, at the workshop where I tried to stitch commissions for local farmers. Jonathan said he believed in me. You've got magic in your hands, he told me. What you need is someone who knows how to sell it. He was a businessman recently returned from Savannah, where he said he'd helped his cousin sell properties. I've got a bit saved up, he said. Enough to make something real. Maybe we make it together. For the first time since Papa died, I felt like I could breathe. Spring came, and I let Jonathan into more than just the shop. I let him into my life, my heart. He would sketch out business plans late into the night while I sewed beside him. We'll call it Whitmore and Blake Fine Stitchery, he said, placing a hand on mine. Give this town a taste of something finer. He kissed me in April, moved in by May. By July, we were talking marriage. I'll surprise you this Christmas, he whispered in my ear one morning. You'll never see it coming. And I didn't. Jonathan and I spent the summer of 1959 in a world of blueprints, fabric samples, and dreams. Every morning, he'd brew fresh coffee and hand me a folded newspaper with property listings circled in red pencil. Someday soon, he'd say, we won't need to rent a place on the edge of town. We'll have a storefront on Main Street. Clara, you'll see. He told me he was in talks with a few friends from Savannah. He said one of them was willing to invest in us. He called it seed money, and it sounded like gold to my ears. I asked him where the money would come from, and he'd smile and say, don't you worry about the how. You just keep sewing. And I did. I stitched until my fingers blistered. Bridal gowns, christening clothes, curtains for old farmhouses. Word of mouth began to spread, and folks from towns as far as Rosewood Hollow and Pennington Pike began leaving little notes at my door with custom orders. By early autumn, I had a small waiting list. In October, Jonathan surprised me with a carved wooden sign that read Whitmore and Blake Stitchery and Custom Design. We nailed it above the shop together, and he kissed my forehead like a promise. That night, as we sat on the porch with a bottle of apple wine, I told him about the dress I was making. He looked at me, eyebrows raised. What dress? I laughed nervously, brushing hair from my face. The wedding dress. You said you had a surprise this Christmas. I figured, maybe that's it. Jonathan paused for a moment too long. His face didn't change, but his eyes flickered like a candle left in a breeze. You shouldn't assume things like that, Clara, he said softly. Surprises only work when they stay surprises. I smiled, but something in me shifted that night like a drawer I hadn't meant to open. Still, I ignored the whispers in my chest. I told myself not to ruin a good thing, but the signs started showing soon after. It was small at first. A letter from Savannah he tore up before I could read. A business ledger he kept locked in his drawer. Phone calls he took at the pay booth, outside Maudie's diner, where he thought I couldn't hear him. I caught fragments. No, she doesn't know, and just wait until I pull it off. I should have left then, but when you've spent your whole life barely getting by, when someone finally offers you warmth, you hold on to it like it's the last fire in winter. In November, Jonathan asked if I could lend him the $1,600 I'd saved from commissions. He said the bank finally approved the lease on a bigger location, but he needed cash to seal the deal. You trust me, don't you? He said, looking at me like I was the only woman in the world, and God help me. I handed him every last penny. He kissed my cheek and said, Christmas is going to change everything. And it did, but not the way I expected. On December 20th, I came home from a delivery to find the shop dark and empty. The books were gone. So was the sign. So was Jonathan. I waited all night. Then I walked to Eldridge First National the next morning, heart hammering in my throat, only to be handed a letter by the clerk at the front desk. It was addressed to me, in Jonathan's handwriting. One page. No apology. Clara, I'm sorry you had to find out like this. The lease was never real. There's no investment. I needed a clean slate, and you were my way there. I'm heading west. Please don't try to find me. You'll land on your feet. I read it twice, and then I laughed, a cold, hollow laugh that didn't sound like me, because right then and there, I knew something Jonathan didn't. He hadn't just taken my savings, he had awakened something far more dangerous. That Christmas was colder than any I remembered. I didn't light the stove. I didn't put up the wreath Papa made out of twisted grapevine and pine cones. I didn't cry. Not anymore. I stared at Jonathan's letter for hours until the ink bled into the folds from my frozen fingertips. But underneath that silence, a plan began to grow. You see, Jonathan Blake didn't just cheat me, he exposed me. Exposed my blindness, my desperation, my need to be saved. I had built my entire future around a man with a polished smile and empty promises. And now that the wool had been yanked from my eyes, I wasn't going to shrink into pity. I wasn't going to fade away like the other girls in town who got fooled and forgotten. I was going to make him regret ever learning my name. The first thing I did was return to the place it all started, Eldridge First National Bank. I wore Papa's old wool coat, now threadbare at the sleeves, and pinned my hair in the tidy bun he always liked. I stepped through the grand oak doors like I was just another tired town girl looking to beg, but this time, I wasn't begging. Mr. Winthrop, the same man who denied my loan thrice before, gave me a tight smile as I stepped into his office. I'm not here for a loan, I said before he could speak. I'm here to ask about acquisitions. He blinked. Pardon? I'd like to understand what it would take to acquire stock in the bank. Not as a customer, as a silent partner. He looked at me like I'd sprouted wings. Miss Whitmore. With respect, this bank doesn't deal in fantasies. I leaned forward. With respect, neither do I. I want to learn. I want to know who owns the most, who owes the most, and what cracks are forming under the surface of this place. Every bank has them, especially ones run by men too arrogant to notice a woman watching. He chuckled, then stopped when he saw I wasn't smiling. You'll need a broker, he muttered. An advisor. Real capital. I'll get it, I said. And when I do, you'll remember this conversation. And I walked out. That day marked the beginning of what I call my second education. I took a job cleaning rooms at the Parkland Inn, where traveling businessmen stayed while passing through Eldridge. Every time I changed sheets or polished shoes, I really listened. I'd overhear which farms were in trouble, which investors were hunting property, which banks were betting on oil fields in Kentucky. I kept a tiny notebook in the lining of my coat and wrote every whisper down. At night, I stitched for extra cash. Baby bonnets, gloves, linens. I sold them to Maudie at the diner, and she resold them to travelers. The income was slow, but it came. By spring, I had enough to move on to the next step. I visited a man named Walter Danning, a former banker who had retired after a scandal involving insider loans. He lived alone on the outskirts of Crescent Ridge. Bitter and brilliant. You don't look like a snake, he said when I knocked on his door. I'm not, I replied, but I need to learn how they move. He laughed then, really laughed. And 3 days later, he began to teach me. Walter taught me everything the banks never did. How to read an institution's books by their public records. How to trace investments back to shell companies. How to make quiet bids. How to listen for tremors before a collapse. You remind me of my sister, he said once. She got cheated by a railroad tycoon back in '42. Took her 5 years, but she buried him in court and bought out his shipping line. I smiled. Then I'm right on schedule. Through Walter's guidance and 2 years of hard, silent work, I began buying up tiny pieces of Eldridge First National, not in my name, of course, but through the help of trusted faces. Maudie, Walter, even Mr. Baird, the postmaster, who hated Winthrop's guts. Every share I bought, every whisper I heard, brought me closer to something I never thought I'd touch again: power. Jonathan may have stolen my savings, but I was about to take something far more valuable: his legacy. By the time summer of 1961 rolled in, the people of Eldridge had no idea I was slowly becoming one of the quietest, most determined investors in town. They still saw me as the seamstress girl who once got jilted by a man who vanished into thin air. I never corrected them. Let them believe I was weak. It made it easier to move in silence. Walter taught me how to use proxies, trustworthy people who didn't mind holding stock under their names for a small cut. Over time, I planted roots into the bank's foundation like ivy, slow, quiet, and unstoppable. I owned just under 8% of Eldridge First National by then. That might sound small, but in a place where families had clung to the same shares for decades, 8% was enough to get the board's attention. But I wasn't ready to reveal myself yet. No, first, I needed to find Jonathan. That part wasn't easy. He'd left without a trace. But men like Jonathan don't disappear, they resurface wherever there's profit. And in the winter of '61, I heard a whisper at the Parkland Inn that made my breath catch. A woman from Cumberland Hill was bragging in the lobby about a new real estate investor who had just built her husband's company a new warehouse out west in Fort Bridges, Nevada. Jonathan Blake, she said, sipping from her silver flask. Handsome devil. Knows how to talk a room into emptying its pockets. I walked out of the room so fast I nearly forgot my coat. Nevada. I sent a letter to Walter, coded in a way we had practiced. 3 days later, he wired me back through a contact. It was true. Jonathan had set up a real estate firm in Fort Bridges under the name Blake and Penner Holdings. The Penner part, as it turned out, was a man who barely showed up. Jonathan was the face, the charm, the mouth, but also the fool. He had married a woman named Eleanor Hensley, a widow with land and no sons. The two of them were hosting an investors' gala at the Fort Bridges Country Hall on December 20th. I circled the date in my calendar with red ink and one word underneath: strike. I spent the next 8 months preparing. I hired a dressmaker in Roseland to sew me a fitted, midnight blue velvet gown with sleeves that draped like royalty. I had Maudie teach me the speech patterns of upper-class women. I had Walter rehearse my cover story until I could recite it half-asleep. By the time I boarded the train to Nevada that December, I wasn't Clara Whitmore, seamstress of Eldridge. I was Claire Whitman, investor from Charleston, South Carolina, representing a silent fund curious about real estate in the West. The gala sparkled with crystal chandeliers and polished men in gray suits. I walked in alone, a gloved hand clutching my satin purse, my eyes fixed straight ahead. And then I saw him, Jonathan Blake. He was older by 2 years, but still had that same glossy hair, that same gleaming smile, the one I had once loved. But now, looking at him was like staring into a storm I had already survived. He didn't recognize me, not even a flicker. "Miss Whitman," he greeted, taking my hand and pressing a kiss to it. "You're even more radiant than your letters suggested." "Mr. Blake," I said, my voice like silk over steel, "I've heard nothing but praise for your ventures. I must admit I'm intrigued." "Oh, I do my best," he grinned. "We're expanding into bank partnerships next year." I smiled. "Oh, I know," I replied. "That's precisely why I came." He escorted me to the ballroom, introduced me to his wife, Eleanor, a tall, fair woman with glassy eyes and a smile that didn't quite reach her mouth. She clutched Jonathan's arm, like someone used to holding on for balance, not affection. I watched. I listened. I learned by the time the gala ended. I had danced with 3 bankers, sipped champagne with 2 investors, and gathered all the information I needed. Jonathan Blake didn't know it, but I was now inches from burning the very ground beneath his feet, because he hadn't just lied to me. He had built his new kingdom with the same tactics: lies, deception, charm, and I had seen it all before. Only now, I was fluent in his game. The day after the gala in Fort Bridges, I sat by the frosted hotel window, reviewing everything I'd gathered like a general preparing for war. Jonathan was growing too fast to loud. His company, Blake and Penner Holdings, had acquired 5 major properties in Nevada in under a year. The man hadn't learned a thing. He was playing the same game he played with me, only now with older men, bigger risks, and more fragile reputations, and that was where I would strike. I returned to Eldridge under the hush of snowfall. The townsfolk had barely noticed I'd been gone except Maudie, who handed me a warm scone and said, "You look like a woman who just saw the future and didn't flinch." She wasn't wrong. Over the next few months, I began planting the final roots of my plan, using Walter's guidance and the silent fund I had built from sewing, investing, and favors owed. I expanded my reach in Eldridge First National. By May 1962, I quietly crossed the 15% ownership threshold, just enough to call a shareholder vote, if needed. But I wasn't done. I began leaking just the right rumors to just the right ears, that Blake and Penner had borrowed far more than they could repay, that the firm was courting risky investors from out east, that Jonathan Blake's charm covered a rotten foundation, and because men in powerful rooms never believe a woman is the one holding the matches. None of them traced the rumors back to me. By early summer, Jonathan sent out an open call to private investors, needing funds to cover a large acquisition near Hollis Creek. I answered under the name Clara Whitmore, of course, and told him I could contribute a generous sum in exchange for full access to his financials. He agreed. He sent me the books, and I almost laughed when I read them. Jonathan had buried himself. He had over-leveraged every property, sold fake stake percentages to multiple investors, and was using newer funds to pay older obligations, a pyramid built on whispers. I'd seen enough. So I wrote a single letter. No threats, no insults, just 3 sentences. Dear Mr. Blake, your financials are alarming. Consider your foundation cracked. Regards, Clara Whitmore. Then I began to move. I used my voting power at Eldridge First National to request a full audit of their business loans, particularly those extended to out-of-state developers. I made it appear routine, just another quarterly procedure. But within 2 weeks, Jonathan's file landed in the office of a man named Henry Ackers, a board member with little patience and even less mercy. Ackers discovered that the Nevada branches had granted Jonathan a line of credit based on falsified equity reports. The hammer fell swiftly. Blake and Penner Holdings was suspended from borrowing. Bank regulators were contacted. And Jonathan Blake? He came tumbling down like a house made of paper. I read the news in the Eldridge Post. Front page, Fort Bridges developer under investigation for fraud. I sat in the diner that day with Maudie and Walter, drinking tea and listening to the men at the next table curse Jonathan's name. Eleanor had reportedly left him. His accounts were frozen. 2 of his business partners filed claims, and still, he didn't know it was me. Not yet, but I wasn't finished. I wanted him to look me in the eye. So in December 1962, exactly 1 year after I first heard his name again, I traveled back to Fort Bridges and requested a meeting under my real name, Clara Whitmore. The secretary blinked. "Are you the seamstress?" I smiled. "Not anymore." Jonathan met me in the ruins of his office, boxes half packed, trophies removed, walls bare. He looked older, hollow. When he saw me, his mouth parted like he'd seen a ghost. "Clara? Hello, Jonathan." He stepped back, stunned. You did this?" I leaned in, my voice calm. "No, Jonathan. You did this. I just made sure the world saw it." He dropped into a chair, eyes wide. "Why?" I pulled a copy of his old letter from my coat pocket, the one he left behind when he ran. I placed it on his desk, and I said, "Because this time, I'm the one writing the ending." After I left Jonathan's crumbling office that December afternoon, I stepped out into the dry, bitter wind of Fort Bridges with no need to look back. It was over. But not complete. The man had been broken, but the system that allowed him to rise, the bank that once turned me away like a street dog, still stood tall on Main Street, Eldridge, with its proud brick columns and smug-faced managers. That place hadn't just denied me a loan, it had denied me dignity. And now, it was time for me to take it. I returned to Eldridge in January 1963. Most of the town was buried in snow, and the holidays had come and gone with little fanfare. But I was already deep into quiet negotiations with Walter and 2 others who had ties to bank shareholders ready to retire. For years now, I had used proxies, Maudie, Walter, even the paper mill foreman's cousin, to purchase small parcels of ownership in Eldridge First National. No one saw me coming because I never used my own name. but now I was ready to come out from behind the curtain. I filed a motion under the name Clara Whitmore Holdings, listing the full stock acquisition numbers. The boardroom went silent when the paper landed on their table. Mr. Curtis Winthrop, still head of the board, still wearing his pinstripe arrogance like a second skin, read the figures twice before lifting his watery eyes to me. You own 28%? I smiled politely. 31. As of this morning, Mrs. Halberd's shares just transferred. He swallowed. You're buying the bank. I'm buying the institution that once told me I was too much of a risk. Yes. You want a seat on the board, he muttered. I folded my gloved hands on the table. No, Mr. Winthrop, I want your seat. There was a pause. Then a chuckle from one of the younger board members. Then a louder one. And then silence again, when I placed a second document on the table. It was a report Walter helped compile, one showing that Winthrop had authorized dozens of bad loans over the years to friends and family, a pattern of negligence that would invite an external audit if made public. Winthrop's hands trembled as he read. This is blackmail. No, I said sweetly. It's business. The same kind of business you played when you denied me based on nothing but my last name and the state of my coat. He stared at me. You resign quietly, with full pension, I continued. And I'll preserve your legacy in the press. Or you'll fight me, and I'll burn this place to the ground on your name. He resigned that evening. By March of 1963, the deed was done. The Eldridge First National Bank, founded in 1892, now had its first female owner and president. People in town talked for weeks. Some praised me, others gossiped, unsure whether I was clever or cruel. I didn't care. I hadn't done this for applause. I did it for every girl like me who'd been told no because her dreams came wrapped in cotton gloves instead of a man's handshake. I did it for Papa, who never lived to see what I could build. And yes, I did it for me, because power, when earned with pain, tastes sharper than honey, and I was only just beginning. That Christmas 5 years after I sat in that bakery corner with $206 to my name, I stood behind the teller's desk in my bank, watching customers line up in coats and scarves. There were wreaths in every window, soft music in the air, and a new sign on the wall, owned and operated by Clara Whitmore. I turned as the doors opened and in walked a familiar figure, Jonathan Blake. He looked different now, weathered, beaten. He approached the desk slowly, hat in hand, like a man looking for the remains of his past. I heard you bought the place, he said quietly. I nodded once. I came to ask if you'd consider a line of credit, just to start again, just something small. I stared at him, letting the silence linger. Then I reached for the same drawer Mr. Winthrop once did, pulled out a letterhead slip, and wrote the same words that were once handed to me. We're sorry, Mr. Blake. You're too much of a risk. I slid it across the counter. He looked at it, then at me, and I smiled, not out of cruelty, but because revenge, when served cold and clean, leaves no aftertaste. After Jonathan walked out of Eldridge First National, I didn't watch him leave. I turned back to my office, shut the glass door behind me, and sat in the very leather chair that once belonged to Mr. Winthrop. Not because I cared for comfort, but because I wanted to feel what it was like to take up space that had never been meant for someone like me. For a while, I let myself feel the full weight of it all. The years, the lies, the cold nights sewing by candlelight, the shame of being poor, the sting of being used, the slow climb back. I had won. But the thing about victory is it doesn't erase the scars. It just teaches you how to wear them. As the days passed, I began reshaping the bank not with vengeance, but with vision. The very first policy I overturned was the loan criteria. No more denying women because their husbands weren't present. No more turning away farmers for wearing muddy boots. No more judging seamstresses because they stitched instead of suited. I hired Annalise Monroe, a bright young girl from Crescent Hollow, as my assistant manager. She reminded me of myself, sharp, observant, with hands that fidgeted when she thought too hard. She had been rejected by 2 banks for a clerk position because she didn't fit the mold. I told her, here, we make our own molds. I created a fund in my father's name, the Peter Whitmore Loan Trust, to support local tradesmen and widows with business dreams. It wasn't charity, it was correction. The kind of correction every small town needs when old men forget how the world is changing. As for Walter Danning, he became my right hand. I gave him a corner office with a view of the square, and he spent his days mentoring young bankers and quietly smiling every time someone called him sir. Maudie stayed behind her diner counter, but now the bank sponsored her pie shop on Sundays. She never took credit for her part in the revenge, but she always made sure the cherry pies were fresh when I came to visit. The town began to change. 2. People who once whispered about me with suspicion began stopping me on the street with respect. The same women who once pitied me now asked for advice. And slowly, Eldridge began to shift, not into a perfect town, but a fairer one. But not everyone was pleased. One afternoon in June, Mayor Billings came into my office, red-faced and sweating. He slammed a letter onto my desk. "You're offering loans to former debtors, women without husbands, colored families from the East Side?" I folded my hands. "Yes." He narrowed his eyes. "This isn't how banking works, Miss Whitmore." I stood, slowly, calmly. "Then perhaps," I said, "banking is what needs to change." He left with a huff. I watched him go, and I didn't blink, because I hadn't come this far to seek approval. I came to rewrite the rules. In early December, as frost began to creep over the windows and children ran through the square tossing snowballs, I received a letter postmarked from Hendersonville. It was from Eleanor Blake, Jonathan's wife, or rather former wife. "Dear Miss Whitmore, I don't know what you did or how you did it, but thank you. You may have saved me from a life I never wanted." He never mentioned your name, but I could see it in his eyes when everything collapsed. He had met his reckoning. I left him before the dust even settled. I have a small home now, a job, and my name back. You reminded me that women can be fire, not just flame. With gratitude, Eleanor. I sat with the letter for a long time, the paper soft beneath my fingers. I never responded. Some things are better left acknowledged in silence. That Christmas, the bank hosted its first community dinner in the lobby. We cleared out desks and ledgers, decorated every window with lanterns and garlands, and turned the great hall into a place of laughter, music, and second chances. I wore a green velvet dress, not because I had anyone to impress, but because it reminded me of the one Jonathan never got to see me wear. As the piano played and children danced, I stepped out into the snowy street for a moment of quiet. The town was lit in gold and white, warm light glowing from every window. I closed my eyes. 5 years ago, I stood here with nothing but debt and tears. Now, I stood taller than any man who ever doubted me. But this story, my story, wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming power, rewriting the ending, and becoming the woman no one thought I could be. By the spring of 1964, I had become more than just the owner of Eldridge First National Bank. I had become something this town had never quite seen before, a woman with influence, not the kind that came from birthright or old family names, not the kind passed from father to son across a dinner table. This was earned, mined from humiliation, stitched from scraps, and polished with grit. But I knew influence meant little if it stayed locked behind a walnut desk and velvet curtains. I didn't claw my way to the top just to sit comfortably. I wanted to reach back down and pull others up with me. So I began what folks came to call the Whitmore Women's Fund. Quietly at first, then louder, I invited widows, single mothers, field girls, retired school teachers, all the women who'd been told to stay in their lane, into the bank after hours. I taught them about ledgers, interest rates, property law. We sat in a circle right under the old chandelier that once cast light on Winthrop and his smug friends. Now it illuminated women with calloused hands, wide eyes, and a hunger to know how the world of money worked. One of them was Ruthie Bell, a 23-year-old farmhand who'd never owned a pair of shoes that weren't secondhand. She brought me a leather notebook one night, filled with plans for a dairy route connecting 3 counties. "I know it's silly," she said, cheeks red. "Just a thought." I read every word. By August, Ruthie had 3 cows, a wagon, and her own business license signed and stamped by my desk, and within a year, she was supplying milk to half the schools in the district. Another was Margaret Lou, a colored woman from the east end of town who came in shaking from head to toe, clutching her late husband's pay stubs. The other banks had turned her away, some without even looking at her papers. I gave her a loan for a tailoring shop. By Christmas, she'd hired 2 apprentices and was sewing uniforms for the local baseball league. Every woman I helped, every one who rose, wasn't just a win for them. It was a message to every man who'd ever laughed when I asked for a chance. One evening, the town paper asked to interview me for a front-page feature. The seamstress who bought the bank. I refused, not because I was shy, but because I didn't want my story to end in triumph. I wanted it to continue in action. Instead, I gave them the names of 5 women from the fund. Let their stories be told. Let the town see that the revolution wasn't just one woman behind a desk. It was a movement. Meanwhile, whispers from Fort Bridges filtered in. Jonathan Blake, now divorced and bankrupt, had moved out west to work as a real estate clerk. His name had become a cautionary tale, his empire a ghost. I never contacted him again. I never needed to. My silence was the loudest answer he could have received. That summer, Walter passed away peacefully in his sleep, with a crossword puzzle still open on his lap. In his will, he left me his cufflinks, a bottle of rye whiskey, and a note that read, "You didn't just win, Clara. You changed the game." And damn if I didn't love watching it happen. I cried for the first time in years that night, not because I was sad, but because I realized how far I'd come and how few truly saw the climb. Later that fall, the state banking board invited me to speak at their annual meeting in Charleston. I stood before a room of mostly men in stiff collars and slick hair, and I told them what no woman had said on that stage before. Banks should not be vaults for the rich. They should be bridges for the working poor. I didn't come here to break glass ceilings. I came here to build new floors for women to stand on. There was stunned silence, then applause, then invitations, but I accepted none. My heart was still in Eldridge. In the creak of the wooden floors, the rustle of ledgers, the scent of Maudie's scones from across the square, I didn't need a spotlight. I already had something better. Impact. That winter, on Christmas Eve, a girl knocked on the bank's door. Just after closing, she was barely 16, shivering in her brother's boots, holding a paper with shaky handwriting. "My ma said you might help," she whispered. I opened the door and smiled. "Yes," I said, "I believe I can." The years passed like turning pages in a thick, old book, soft at the edges, worn by weather and time. But each page was mine, written in ink I had earned, not borrowed. By 1966, Eldridge First National Bank wasn't just known as the institution that had once denied a poor seamstress. It was known as the People's Bank, my bank. But it never truly felt like mine. It felt like ours, built by every woman who dared to hope, every hand that dropped coins into jars, every girl who watched her mother stretch pennies into meals. And now, the girls were watching me. One afternoon in September, I stood in front of the Eldridge School for Girls, where I'd been invited to speak. The building smelled like chalk and wood polish. I could see little heads in tidy rows through the hallway windows, girls from farming families, teachers' daughters, seamstresses' nieces. When I stepped to the podium, I wasn't dressed in fine fabrics or pearls. I wore the same cotton blouse my father had stitched for me when I was 17, a quiet reminder of where I'd started. I spoke slowly, clearly. I was once told I wasn't worth the risk, that my ideas didn't matter, that I was just a woman with empty hands and borrowed dreams. I paused. Now I know those hands weren't empty. They were ready. I looked at their wide eyes, and I said what I needed to hear at their age. You don't need permission to become powerful. You only need persistence. Afterward, a girl named Louisa Carter approached me, no older than 12. She held a sketch of a bakery with flowers painted on the windows. "I want to build this one day," she said softly. I knelt down, smiled, and whispered back, "Then let's start drawing the floor plan." Back at the bank, I kept her sketch pinned beside my desk. A daily reminder that legacy wasn't always what you leave, it's what you inspire while you're still here. But not everything was hopeful. That November, I received a letter from Fort Bridges. No return address, just a name, scrawled with shaky ink. Jonathan Blake. Didn't know what I expected when I opened it. Regret? Bitterness? It was neither. "Clara, I won't pretend I didn't deserve everything that happened. I've lost more than I ever had the right to keep. But I see now, I didn't just hurt you. I set something terrible in motion inside myself. I see your name in the papers sometimes. You've done more good than I ever dreamed of doing. There's no forgiveness here, just acknowledgement. I hope you'll find peace in what you've built." I read it once, then burned it, not out of hate, but because some words belong to fire more than memory. That winter, we held our 3rd annual Whitmore Women's Banquet. Over 200 women attended, farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, and newly elected officials. We served chicken pot pie and cider, and played the same records Papa used to whistle to. Margaret Lou gave a speech. Ruthie brought her baby girl. And Maudie, sweet, sturdy Maudie, stood up and toasted me with a tear in her eye. "To Clara," she said. Not because she survived, but because she transformed. The hall applauded. I sat still, a lump in my throat. It was the kind of moment I used to dream of, back when I had nothing but a cold bed and a broken heart, but now I had purpose. Not revenge, not pride. Something gentler, stronger. That Christmas, I walked down Maple Street, where the children were building snowmen and mothers were stringing lights in their windows. A little boy ran up beside me, maybe 5 or 6, grinning. "You're the bank lady," he shouted. I chuckled. "That's what they say. My mama said you saved our house." I paused, heart tight. "She saved it," I told him, kneeling down. "I just opened the door." He smiled like he understood something most grown men still hadn't figured out. Then he ran off, boots crunching through snow. That night, I lit the fireplace in my father's old house, the one I'd almost lost. I hung the same wreath from my childhood, patched together from pine cones and ribbon, now faded and delicate. I sat in Papa's armchair with a cup of tea, gazing at the fire, thinking of every version of myself I'd survived to become the woman I was now. Not just Clara Whitmore, the woman who bought the bank, but the woman who never let pain be the final chapter. On Christmas morning, 1967, I awoke before the sun rose. The house was silent, just the ticking of the old mantel clock Papa had carved with his initials when I was a girl. Snow lay thick outside the window, soft and glowing like the world had been dusted in peace. I wrapped myself in a knitted shawl, poured coffee into a china cup with a faded gold rim, and stepped out onto the porch. Main Street was quiet, no footsteps yet. No carolers, no wagons. Just the hush of a town still asleep, unaware that it had become a place where women walked taller, where dignity had been stitched into the very bricks of the bank on the corner. I stood there for a while, watching smoke curl from chimneys, remembering who I used to be. 5 Christmases ago, I was in debt, abandoned, humiliated. Now I stood as the owner of the very bank that once rejected me, surrounded by a town I had reshaped. One loan, one woman, one bold decision at a time. It wasn't just about Jonathan anymore. In truth, it hadn't been for a long time. Yes, I broke him. Yes, I returned the humiliation with a quiet, strategic storm he never saw coming. But revenge had been the match. What followed was the fire of transformation. In the months after the last banquet, I had received dozens of letters from women all over the state. Some asked for help, some offered thanks. A few even shared stories eerily similar to mine, men who'd disappeared with dowries, banks that turned them away, shame buried beneath silence. I answered each one, not with pity, with plans. By 1968, I'd begun purchasing stock in 3 other small-town banks across the region, not for control but for influence. I sent trained women from Eldridge to take jobs there, clerks, managers, assistants. Slowly, quietly, we spread, not a revolution of fire, but one of persistence, one town at a time. That spring, I appointed Annalise Monroe as my successor. She cried when I told her. "But this is your bank," she whispered. I shook my head gently. "No, Annalise, this is our bank, and now it's your time to protect it." I stayed on in name, but stepped back in duty. I had climbed my mountain. Now, I wished to walk its ridges and admire the view. In the fall of 1969, I took the train to Hollis Creek, where Ruthie Bell was being honored by the Agricultural Council. I sat in the back, no one knowing who I was, just smiling as she spoke about cows, roots, and starting with $3 in a wagon. Afterward, she found me, hugged me. "Would have never made it without you," she said. I shook my head. "You would have. You just needed a crack in the door." Before the year ended, I bought back the sewing machine my father once pawned. It wasn't much to look at: rusted knobs, a faded foot pedal, but I placed it in my study, right beside the bank's original ledger book. A reminder of beginnings, of struggle, of what can grow when no one's looking. On the last day of 1970, I stood once more in the bank lobby, the building decorated for the new year. I ran my hand across the teller windows, the same ones where I was once told no, where now, young girls stood giving out loans to customers who looked like my mother, my neighbors, myself. Jonathan Blake's name had long since faded from the newspapers. I never heard from him again. I never needed to. He had been a chapter, not the story. This was the story. When I stepped outside, the streets were filled with lanterns. People were singing. Fireworks lit the sky, and there, among the crowd, I saw a young girl with wide eyes and frost in her curls, standing by her mother, clutching a small paper folder stamped Eldridge First National. Hope passed like a torch. I turned, Walking home beneath the stars, whispering a thank you to the girl I once was, she who wept in the cold, she who stitched late into the night, she who believed, even in the silence, that one day the world would hear her story. Now it has. And if you're reading this, if you've ever been told you are not enough, know this. You are more than the debt they weigh you down with, more than the shame they hang around your neck. You are not their mistake. You are your own masterpiece. Clara Whitmore Reflections 1. What would you have done in Clara's place after Jonathan left? 2. Was her revenge justified, or did her legacy matter more in the end? 3. Can one woman's transformation spark a change in an entire town? Subscribe to more revenge stories. Share, like, comment.